Hello and welcome. Wherever you are right now, I invite you to settle in. Maybe you're lying down. Maybe you're just looking for something quiet to carry you through the night. Either way, you're here. And perhaps that means you're like many of us, drawn to things that lie just outside the reach of what we're allowed to know. There's a place in the world that many think they understand, a place of robes and rituals, of ancient prayers echoing through golden halls. For most, it represents light guidance and spiritual authority. And yet, behind the reverence, behind the ceremony, behind even the silence, lies something else. Not something sinister, not exactly, but something that resists being seen. Something closed. The Vatican. It's a name that carries weight, power, mystery, but also a kind of unspoken boundary. There are places there that few have ever entered. Rooms without names, archives sealed for centuries, texts that no one alive is allowed to read. Why? That's not for us to answer, not yet. But if you feel that pull, that quiet sense that something doesn't quite add up, then you're not alone. This isn't a story of scandal. It's not about attacking belief or questioning faith, quite the opposite. This is a journey into what remains unknown, not to disprove, but to understand, to wonder, to listen to the silence and ask gently, why is it so silent? Over the course of this journey, we'll pass through hidden corridors, sealed vaults, ancient prophecies, and the edges of history itself. You won't be asked to believe anything. You'll only be asked to consider what lies just beyond the light in that soft gray twilight between fact and legend, record and rumor, faith and forgetting. So I invite you now to slow down. Let the outside world fall away, if only for a little while. Close your eyes if you'd like, and step with me into the quiet halls of the unknown to explore the 15 unsolved mysteries of the Vatican. Some of these stories are hidden. Others are simply not spoken of. But all of them have waited. And now, so have you. Shall we begin? Mystery number 1. The Vatican Secret Archives. Over 50 miles of hidden documents. It begins with a hallway, not grand or golden like the chapels above it, but long, cold, and quiet, lined not with saints or statues, but with doors that don't bear names. And behind those doors are shelves, endless shelves, paper, parchment, leather-bound volumes aged into silence, more than 50 miles of them. If you were to walk through the Vatican Secret Archives without stopping, it would take you days. And yet most of what lies inside has not been seen by human eyes in centuries, perhaps longer. This is not a myth. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly known as the Vatican Secret Archive, is very real. Its official purpose, to house the private correspondence and administrative records of the popes across centuries, a noble function. And yet, despite its name, change secretum, they say, meaning private, not hidden, the questions remain. Because within those walls, somewhere behind locked gates and beneath heavy floors, lie documents so old, so fragile, so potentially controversial, that even scholars granted access are only allowed to see precisely what they request, never more. And many requests are quietly, politely denied. Some say the archives hold letters from emperors and kings, confessions from martyrs, and edicts that shape the very direction of modern civilization. Others whisper of something deeper, scrolls older than Christianity itself, fragments of lost gospels, prophecies written in forgotten tongues. Perhaps even early writings about a man named Jesus that differ in subtle but seismic ways from the stories that shape the world. And then there are the rumors. claims that the archives contain correspondence between the Vatican and Mussolini Hitler, even the early Soviet regime. That somewhere in those stacks is a letter signed by Galileo pleading for understanding, or notes from the Inquisition, chilling in tone, detailed in method. One can't help but wonder, if those things exist, why not share them? What could be so dangerous about paper and ink? There are those who believe that the archives are not only historical, but tactical. That information has been preserved not to illuminate, but to protect. Because power, even spiritual power, can become tangled in politics, war, and human fear. Knowledge once revealed cannot be returned to silence. And some knowledge may change how we see everything. Satellite images of the Vatican reveal vast reinforced underground structures. Digitization is said to be underway, but only for select documents. The rest, still waiting, still locked, still watched. And when reporters, historians, or curious minds inquire about their contents, the answers are always calm, brief, practiced. This is not for public access. This has not yet been reviewed. Or most often, no comment. Yet whispers persist about a room with no catalog, about a vault whose keys are known to only 2 people at a time, about maps not of the earth as it is, but as it once may have been, about artifacts too sacred or too strange for the daylight. One document long rumored to exist describes something called the chronovisor, a supposed device built in the mid-20th century by a Benedictine monk and 2 scientists, which allegedly allowed its users to see into the past images of ancient Rome, even scenes from biblical Jerusalem. The Vatican has denied its existence. But why then did one of the scientists later disappear? Why were the monks who spoke of it silenced their accounts, retracted their names, erased from official records? Could it be that this device never existed, a creation of overactive minds? Of course, but the mind cannot help but ask, if even part of it were true, what might they have seen? What truths would be too powerful to speak? In many ways, the existence of the archives is not the mystery. The mystery is in their silence, because knowledge tends to reach us somehow, eventually. But this knowledge resists. It does not want to be found. Or perhaps it wants to be remembered only by those who already know. And what if that's the point? That some truths are not buried by accident, but preserved deliberately, not to be lost, but to be withheld. Held in reserve like a storm behind glass. There is no proof of conspiracy here, only questions. But questions, when left unanswered long enough, begin to shift into something else. They become shadows, presences, the soft creak of something ancient locked behind a door you can't open, whispering just out of reach. And that's where we'll leave the first mystery. Not with conclusion, but with silence, because silence can say more than words ever will. But don't drift too far. There's more to see. And now, we move forward. Mystery number 2. The third secret of Fatima, what wasn't revealed. It begins not in a grand cathedral or ancient vault, but in a wide empty field. The year was 1917. The place Fatima, a small rural village in Portugal, far from the corridors of Rome. The sun was high. The sky was clear. And 3 shepherd children stood before a light they could not understand. What they saw and what they claimed to hear would echo for more than a century. Not because of what was said, but because of what never was. According to the official record, a woman brighter than the sun appeared to the children 6 times, delivering 3 secrets that were meant to be shared with the world in due time. The first 2 secrets were revealed not long after. They spoke of visions of hell, of war, and piece of repentance and prayer. Troubling, yes, but understandable. The third secret, however, was different. The third secret was withheld. For decades, it remained locked in the Vatican's possession, sealed in an envelope known only to a handful of people, including successive popes. The public waited, speculated, and wondered what could possibly be so devastating, so disruptive, that it could not be spoken aloud. Over time, this silence did not comfort, it disturbed. The longer the Church waited to reveal the third secret, the more haunting it became. Then in the year 2000, the Vatican released a statement. The third secret, it said, had finally been disclosed. It described a vision in which a bishop in white, widely interpreted to be the Pope, was killed along with many others as they walked through a ruined city. The imagery was tragic, apocalyptic, but to many it felt incomplete, lacking, strangely sanitized. There was no clear message, no named event, no call to action. It felt, some said, like a curtain had been drawn open, only halfway. Among those who expressed doubts was Cardinal Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, who before becoming Pope had reportedly read the secret and described it as too dangerous to release at the time. Even Sister Lucia, the last surviving seer, once hinted that the message included words directly from the Virgin Mary, words that were never published. Why the omission? Why the delay? Why the sense that something remains hidden? Conspiracy theorists were quick to respond. Some claimed the unreleased portion predicted a crisis of faith within the Church itself. Others whispered of warnings about Satan infiltrating the highest levels of religious leadership. A few pointed to the 1981 assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II, suggesting the Vatican edited the third secret after the fact to match the narrative. If so, what else had been left out? There were documents unconfirmed, untraceable, that surfaced over the years. One known as the suppressed text allegedly includes the line, "In Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved." The implication being that elsewhere, it would not. If real, that fragment alone suggests a prophecy not of global catastrophe, but of internal collapse, a loss of integrity, a warning not for the outside world, but for the Church itself. Skeptics argue that none of these claims are provable, and they're right, but neither have they been conclusively denied. To this day, many Catholics and scholars remain convinced that the full secret has not been released, that the Vatican, fearing panic or rebellion or disillusionment, chose a version of the truth that would be easier to bear. And here's where the silence grows heavier. Because if a message from beyond, whatever form that may take, truly warned of danger, not from enemies, but from within, then hiding it would not just be cautious. It would be necessary, protective, even strategic. There's precedent for this. Other visions and prophecies declared by saints or mystics have been kept from public view throughout history, either because they threatened theological stability or hinted too directly at real-world powers. The third secret of Fatima, if interpreted in that light, becomes more than a spiritual tale. It becomes a political act, a calculated containment. One former Vatican official, speaking anonymously to an Italian journalist in the early 2000s, claimed there was a second envelope, one that contained the original text in Sister Lucia's handwriting, separate from the vision itself. This envelope, he alleged, was stored in a special safe and seen by fewer than 5 people in the world. When pressed, the Vatican neither confirmed nor denied the report. The safe, if it exists, remains unopened to this day. And that brings us to a question that cannot be dismissed. If a warning exists about the fragility of faith, about corruption or conflict at the highest levels, who decides whether we deserve to hear it? Is it mercy to protect the public from such messages? Or is it something else? There's something haunting in the idea of a secret kept not because it isn't true, but because it is. And that truth, once spoken, might change everything. The third secret of Fatima may have been released, or it may have been rewritten, revised, reshaped for safer consumption. Whatever the case, the mystery remains, not in the words themselves, but in the silence surrounding them. A silence that still pulses like a heartbeat beneath the marble halls of Rome. So we move on now, not because this secret is solved, but because it, like the others, leads only deeper. And deeper still, we must go. Mystery, the 3. The chronovisor, a device that sees through time. There are inventions we dream of, and then there are those we never speak of, not because they're impossible, but because they're uncomfortable. The chronovisor belongs to the latter. It isn't a device you'll find in any museum. It isn't mentioned in mainstream history books. And yet, in hushed corners of the Vatican's past, the story lingers. Persistent, elusive, disturbing in its implications. The first public mention came in 1972 in a book written by an Italian priest named Father François Brune. In it, he claimed that another Benedictine monk, Father Pellegrino Ernetti, a respected scholar of archaic music and a Vatican insider, had confided in him the existence of a machine that could observe past events, not imagine them, not simulate them, but observe them as they happened. The chronovisor. According to Ernetti, the device was built sometime in the 1950s or early 60s through a collaboration between scientists from the Vatican and others connected to European governments, even some who had worked on advanced physics and radar systems during World War II. Among them, he claimed, was Enrico Fermi, a key figure in the Manhattan Project, and Wernher von Braun, the aerospace engineer, who would later become instrumental to NASA. Neither man ever publicly commented on the claim. Both by then were gone. The chronovisor Ernetti said was small enough to fit in a room. It used a series of antennas, cathode ray tubes, and unknown alloys to detect residual electromagnetic echoes from past events, visual and auditory imprints that supposedly still exist in the fabric of space-time. In theory, this would allow the viewer to witness any moment in history as though tuning into a broadcast from the past. The team, according to Ernetti, had viewed speeches by Napoleon, the crucifixion of Christ, and even scenes from ancient Rome. It would be easy to dismiss this as fiction, and many have. But then something strange happened. A photo surfaced. Black and white, grainy, unremarkable at first glance. It claimed to show Jesus on the cross, an image supposedly captured by the chronovisor. The photo was published, then retracted. Critics noted that it resembled a known sculpture. Supporters countered that this may have been a deliberate misinformation tactic, a cover layered over something more authentic. The Vatican's response? Official silence. No acknowledgement, no denial. Just stillness. In 2002, the Vatican issued a curious statement, one that didn't name the chronovisor directly, but warned that anyone using or building such a device would risk excommunication. The statement, though brief, only added fuel to the speculation. Why mention something officially unacknowledged? Why threaten punishment for something that supposedly doesn't exist? Father Ernetti himself became increasingly quiet in his final years. On his deathbed, he reportedly retracted the entire story, saying it had been a fabrication. And yet those close to him claimed he was under pressure, that he had been visited, that his writings and personal documents had been taken. When he passed, no chronovisor was ever found. If it had existed, it was gone, or never there at all. So we're left with the question, what if it had existed, and what if it still does? If one had the ability to view the past with total fidelity, no distortion, no interpretation, just pure replay, what would that mean? For history, for theology, for truth. The implications are staggering. Religious events once based on faith would become verifiable or refutable. Political events open to reinterpretation. Ancient texts proven or disproven in an instant. Reality itself adjusted. That kind of power is seductive, but it's also dangerous because the past isn't just memory, it's structure. If you change how people see it, you change the future they believe in. You change their identity. There are parallels here. In the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union explored remote viewing and PSI phenomena through classified programs like Stargate and MK Ultra. Could the Vatican, a sovereign state with its own scientific and theological apparatus, have pursued similar experiments but cloaked under the veil of secrecy? Some have pointed to Vatican connections to obscure European laboratories, particularly in Switzerland and southern Germany, where research into magnetic fields and signal anomalies took place during the 1950s. Others note the presence of strange patents filed by unnamed inventors that echo components described in Ernetti's account. And then there's the cultural footprint, or lack of it. The fact that the chronovisor remains virtually unknown outside small circles, despite the magnitude of its claim, is perhaps its most intriguing detail. If it were pure fiction, wouldn't it have spread, been adapted, exploited by popular media? Instead, it sits quietly just beneath the threshold of belief, as though something is holding it in place, restraining it. Could it be that the real value of the chronovisor was never technological, but spiritual? The act of seeing history, not as we interpret it, but as it was unfiltered, uncomfortable, might threaten the very balance between faith and evidence. Perhaps that's why it was hidden, if it ever existed at all. And yet, we return again to the silence. Not denial, not satire, just that heavy, deliberate absence of reaction, as though the story touches something that should not be touched. The Vatican holds many artifacts, many books, but the chronovisor, if it was ever real, may not be on a shelf. It may not even be in Rome. Some believe it was dismantled and hidden in parts. Others think it was never physical, that it was symbolic, a metaphor for a way of seeing, a code, a warning, or perhaps a promise. Whatever it was, it remains one of the strangest stories ever whispered within the walls of the Holy See. And so we move on, eyes still open, ears still listening, because silence, as always, hides the most fascinating things. Mystery 4. The Vatican Library. What are they hiding? It feels almost wrong to call it a library. The word suggests something public. A place you can walk into, pull a book from the shelf, sit beneath warm light, and disappear into someone else's thoughts. But the Vatican Library isn't like that. It doesn't invite you in. It doesn't welcome your curiosity. It doesn't open its shelves. It watches. Founded officially in 1475, but with roots reaching much further back, the Vatican Apostolic Library is home to one of the largest and oldest collections of texts in the world, over 1.1 million printed books, 75,000 codices, and more than 8,500 incunabula, or books printed before the year 1500. It is a treasure chest of human history. But like any locked chest, what matters most isn't the chest itself, it's the key. And the key in this case is permission. Most people will never walk its corridors. Even most scholars are granted access only to selected portions, and only after formal vetting and approval. There are sections of the library that remain permanently off limits, others that are open in name but practically unreachable. Many of the texts have not been translated, digitized, or even fully cataloged. They exist, but in a kind of suspended silence, untouched for centuries, perhaps intentionally so. Among the documents confirmed to be held inside are letters from Michelangelo and Galileo, medieval manuscripts bound in human skin, early versions of the Bible, some written in languages few today can read that diverge subtly and sometimes significantly from modern versions, papal decrees written during the Crusades, maps showing regions of the world not yet discovered by explorers of the time, fragments of lost classical works, plays, philosophies, medical treatises from ancient Greece and Rome, absent from any other known record. And then there are the rumors. Some say the library holds gospels that were excluded from the canon, not merely apocryphal, but contradictory. Accounts of the life of Christ that portray him not as divine, but as a teacher. Others speak of texts from Eastern traditions, Buddhist scrolls, Islamic writings, even pre-Columbian codices acquired over centuries of missionary and colonial expansion, then stored unread in climate-controlled silence. Still others point to something older, much older. Writings not in Latin or Greek, but in unknown scripts. Tablets and scrolls said to have been unearthed during early excavations in Mesopotamia and Egypt, texts that discuss cycles of civilization, great floods, and knowledge passed down from beings of light. These stories, if true, would place the Vatican Library not merely as a repository of Western thought, but as a guardian of something more primal, a collective memory that predates recorded history itself. Of course, there is no hard evidence. The Vatican neither confirms nor denies the contents of its restricted collections. And perhaps that's the point. Because once a thing is confirmed, it can be debated. But while it remains a rumor, it floats, unchallengeable, untouchable. Some believe that inside the library lies the original text of the Testament of Solomon, a document said to describe the construction of the first temple using magical powers and the control of demons. Others suspect that early astrological maps detailed startlingly accurate depictions of the stars were acquired during the Renaissance and hidden away because of their implications, alignments that seemed too perfect, mathematical models too advanced for their time. There's even been speculation about records of extraterrestrial encounters. Whispers that the Vatican, having operated as both a religious and diplomatic entity for centuries, received reports, even artifacts related to phenomena far beyond the earthly. Some of these claims stem from leaked letters between Vatican officials and American intelligence agencies during the 20th century, referencing celestial events and non-terrestrial observation. Skeptics dismiss these stories as exaggerations, misunderstandings, or outright fabrications. And perhaps they're right. But what fuels the mystery isn't just what might be inside, it's the refusal to open the door. In 2010, a limited digitization effort began, funded in part by American tech philanthropists. A few thousand pages have since been released online, most of them theological in nature. The Vatican announced this project with pride, a move toward transparency. But then, progress slowed, updates stopped, and vast sections of the library remain beyond reach. If this were any other institution, such silence might be chalked up to bureaucracy or academic overload. But the Vatican is not just a library. It is a nation, a spiritual authority, a symbol, and symbols once shaken can lose their power. So perhaps the silence is not born of secrecy, but of stewardship. Perhaps what is inside is too powerful, too fragile, too easily misunderstood. Still, the questions linger. Why hold texts that no one reads? Why protect manuscripts if their content poses no threat? What are they preserving, and from whom? There's something almost sacred in the idea that some knowledge is meant to be preserved, not used. But there's also something troubling, because knowledge that is locked away is not truly knowledge. It becomes legend, power, leverage. And so the Vatican Library remains a paradox, a place that holds the history of human belief, but also the history of human doubt. A place where light filters softly through ancient windows, illuminating pages that haven't been turned in generations. We cannot say what's being hidden, but we can say this: whatever it is, it matters. Because nothing is guarded this carefully unless it changes something. And so we walk forward again, not into the light, not into the dark, but into that quiet place in between. Mystery survive. The Vatican and the Nazis, a deal with darkness. Some mysteries are buried in myth, others are sealed in vaults. But the most unsettling ones linger in plain sight, not because they are hidden, but because they are unresolved. Their edges blur with memory. Their facts sit uneasily beside moral silence. This is one of those mysteries. The question isn't whether the Vatican knew. The question is how much it saw and why it chose to remain so quiet. The 1930s brought storm clouds to Europe. As Hitler rose to power, the world hesitated, unsure whether to believe the worst of what he promised. The Church, too, stood at a crossroads. In 1933, just months after Hitler became Chancellor, the Vatican signed the Reichskonkordat, a concordat, or treaty between the Holy See and Nazi Germany. Its stated goal was to protect the rights of the Catholic Church in Germany. But in exchange, it required silence, political neutrality, a withdrawal from open resistance. At first glance, it was a diplomatic move, pragmatic, defensive, perhaps even hopeful. But history rarely leaves actions unweighted. Over time, the Church's silence became harder to defend. As Jewish citizens were stripped of rights, deported, and ultimately exterminated by the millions, the Vatican's public statements remained carefully worded, veiled in abstraction, or altogether absent. Pope Pius XII, who held the papacy during the Second World War, is at the center of this storm. To his supporters, he was a quiet resistor, working behind the scenes to protect Jewish lives through secret channels, hidden shelters, and discreet diplomacy. And indeed, there are documented cases of Jewish families being sheltered by Catholic institutions in Rome and across Europe, some with direct papal knowledge. But to his critics, that very silence was the failure. They argue that the moral weight of the papacy could have shaken the conscience of the world if only it had spoken more loudly, more clearly, more often. The Vatican's defenders point to its fear of Nazi retaliation. That open condemnation could have sparked violent backlash, not only against the Jews, but against Catholics across occupied Europe. Others suggest that the Vatican was playing a longer game preserving the institution itself to prevent its complete annihilation. A kind of strategic passivity, survival disguised as neutrality. But then, there are darker claims. Documents unearthed in recent decades suggest that certain church officials may have been more than just silent. they may have been complicit. Not in ideology, perhaps, but in logistics. After the war, a network known as the Rat Lines emerged escape routes used by former Nazi officers to flee Europe. Many of these routes passed through Catholic institutions, often using church-issued papers or safe houses provided by sympathetic clergy. Most notably, men like Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of the Holocaust, and Josef Mengele, the angel of death from Auschwitz, managed to escape capture for years using forged documents that led them through Italy and into South America. In some cases, those documents bore the stamp of church organizations. Whether these were the actions of rogue priests or part of a deeper structured effort remains contested. In 2020, under growing international pressure, the Vatican opened parts of its World War II archives. Scholars expected clarity. What they found instead was complexity. Records were missing. Communications were ambiguous. Memos hinted at knowledge concern and yet restraint. The phrase diplomatic silence appears often a choice of language that carries the weight of countless lives. And then, as always, come the questions. Was this silence a shield, or was it a veil? Did the church do what it could, given the constraints? Or did it choose to protect its own legacy over the truth? There are parallels in other regimes. Institutions across Europe, governments, banks, even universities struggled with their roles during fascism. Some resisted, some collaborated, most survived. But the Vatican is not merely an institution. It is a moral voice, a symbol of eternal truth. And when symbols remain silent during moral crises, their silence becomes something else. It becomes a wound. Conspiracy theorists take this further, of course. Some believe the Vatican knew far more than it admitted, that it not only facilitated escape, but protected knowledge treasures looted by the Nazis, esoteric artifacts tied to mysticism, even early research into genetic experimentation. These claims are largely unsupported. But as with all secrets, it is the absence of transparency that gives the theories space to grow. The most troubling idea is not that the Vatican acted with evil intent, but that it hesitated, that it measured its voice, that it calculated its moral outrage against the odds of institutional survival. And perhaps in that calculation, something irreplaceable was lost. Today, the Vatican stands firm in its defense of Pius XIII. Pope Francis himself has encouraged scholars to explore the wartime archives in full. The Church insists it has nothing to hide, but opening the vault is only the first step. Understanding what's inside and why it took so long to see it is something else entirely. Some truths are not denied. They are simply never fully faced. And so, this mystery remains suspended, not because it is unsolved, but because it is still unfolding, still being studied, still echoing. The past does not accuse, it waits. And every silence is eventually filled, either with truth or with shadow. We keep moving now, because the next door is already waiting, and what lies behind it may be even more quiet. Mystery Lecture 6, The Lucifer Telescope. Why does the Vatican monitor the skies? There's something ancient in the act of looking up. Long before telescopes and satellites, before faith systems or empires, the night sky was the first cathedral. The stars were the first scripture, distant, silent, unchanging. And yet, in their stillness, they moved something in us. A longing, a question. Not just what is out there, but why are we here? It's no surprise, then, that religious institutions have long observed the heavens. But when the Vatican, a city built not to watch the stars, but to bring eyes downward in reverence, quietly began investing in advanced astronomical research, people started to ask, what exactly are they looking for? High atop Mount Graham in Arizona, perched among the dry pines and thin air of the Sonoran Desert, stands one of the most advanced optical telescopes in the world. It's part of the Mount Graham International Observatory, operated in partnership by several institutions, including the Vatican. That fact alone might seem curious, but what caught the public's attention wasn't the telescope itself. It was the name attached to one of its instruments, LUCIFER. Though later rebranded as LUCI Early Documentation, confirmed that the original acronym stood for Large Binocular Telescope Near Infrared Utility with Camera and Integral Field Unit for Extragalactic Research, a long name engineered for precision. But the coincidence or not was too striking to ignore. Why choose that name? Why, of all possible designations, invoke a word so deeply charged with meaning, especially within the Catholic tradition? The Vatican officially distanced itself from the name, clarifying that LUCI is a separate instrument operated by German scientists and not directly controlled by the Holy See. Technically, that's accurate, but it does little to quiet the curiosity because the Vatican has maintained a dedicated observatory since the 16th century. Today, the Vatican Observatory Research Group, VORG, maintains a presence at Mount Graham, with astronomers, including Jesuit priests, working year-round to study exoplanets' stellar formation and deep space anomalies. The official explanation is straightforward science in harmony with faith, a desire to better understand God's creation. And yet the timing and location invite deeper questions. Mount Graham is a sacred site to the Apache people, a mountain believed to hold spiritual significance and ancient energies. Environmental protests delayed the observatory's construction for years. And when it was finally built quietly with minimal public engagement, it raised eyebrows in both scientific and religious communities. Why here? Why now? Why infrared? Infrared astronomy allows researchers to see what is invisible to the human eye: heat signatures, ancient galaxies, and faint objects shrouded in dust and distance. It reveals the hidden, the old, the cold. And that some speculate is the point. Among UFO researchers and fringe theorists, the Vatican's presence at Mount Graham is seen as far more than academic. They argue that the Church is preparing not for what we've found, but for what might soon be revealed. Some claim Vatican astronomers have detected anomalies near specific star systems. Others believe the observatory's true purpose is not to look outward, but to monitor something approaching. There are whispers, unverifiable but persistent, of confidential meetings between Vatican officials and scientific agencies discussing non-human intelligences and the theological implications of contact. Is any of it true? No one can say for sure. But what fuels the speculation is not just the name Lucifer, or the remote location, or even the Vatican's involvement in astronomy. It's the subtle shift in tone from church leadership over the past 2 decades, a quiet but growing openness to the idea that we are not alone. High-ranking Vatican scientists, including Father José Gabriel Funes, former director of the Vatican Observatory, have gone on record saying the existence of extraterrestrial life would not contradict Catholic theology. That belief in a creator does not preclude the possibility of other created beings. That contact, if it came, would not be a crisis of faith, but a broader understanding of divine intention. To many, these are progressive ideas, forward-thinking, comforting even. But others hear something else: preparation. The Vatican has long stood as a mediator between the material and the metaphysical. Its concern is not just facts, but meaning. If something were approaching, not in science fiction, but in science, the Church would be among the first to consider its spiritual impact, how it would reshape belief, identity, morality. Could the observatory be a watchtower, then a modern-day sentinel, not looking for God, but watching what might come from the dark? Again, there is no proof, only alignment, infrastructure, and silence. The Lucii instrument, despite its name, is only a lens, but names matter, especially in places like this. A name is never just a word. It is a signal, an intention. And when the signal echoes through a tradition that has spent centuries guarding the threshold between heaven and earth, people listen. It may all be nothing, just coincidence, a mirror reflecting our own fascination with the stars. But still, they look, night after night, quietly, patiently. What do they see? What are they waiting for? We may never know, or perhaps we already do. So we step away now, just slightly from the telescope's unblinking gaze. Not because the mystery has ended, but because its silence is too complete. Like the sky itself, there are other shadows waiting, and one of them lives beneath the earth. Mystery Number 7. Disappearances inside the Vatican. The case of Emanuela Orlandi. Her name was Emanuela, 16 years old, a music student, the daughter of a Vatican employee. On June 22, 1983, she left her home within Vatican City for a flute lesson in Rome, a walk she had taken many times before. She never came back. There are moments that freeze in time. Phone calls unanswered. Doors left ajar. The flicker of a summer evening that never settles into night. And in this case, it wasn't just a disappearance. It was the vanishing of something deeper. A question that even 40 years later continues to breathe just beneath the polished surface of the Vatican's eternal calm. Emanuela Orlandi's disappearance is not a typical missing persons case. Not because of her age or circumstances or timing, but because of where she lived. Vatican City is the smallest sovereign state in the world, but also one of the most secure. With less than 1,000 residents' guarded entrances and intense internal order, it is not a place where people simply vanish. And yet, that's what happened. Her last known location was near a bus stop in central Rome. Witnesses say she spoke briefly with someone about a job offer from a cosmetics company. She sounded uncertain. Then she was gone. What followed wasn't just mystery, it was noise. A symphony of contradictory leads, anonymous phone calls, and claims that came from the edge of reason. Some said she had been kidnapped by an Eastern Bloc intelligence agency in exchange for the release of Mehmet Ali Aka, the Turkish gunman who had attempted to assassinate Pope John Paul II 2 years earlier. Others claimed she was taken by a criminal organization with ties to Vatican banking scandals, a payment perhaps, or a warning. There were even those who believed she had run away voluntarily, caught in a storm of adolescent confusion and secrets. But her family never believed that, nor did the public. And then silence. Over the decades, new fragments continued to emerge. In 2005, an anonymous caller on an Italian television program suggested that Emanuela was buried in the crypt of the Basilica of Santa Apollinare, a place tied to Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, a controversial figure associated with the Vatican Bank. The Vatican denied any connection. In 2012, Italian journalist Emiliano Fittipaldi obtained confidential Vatican documents suggesting that the Holy See may have spent considerable funds on Emanuela's maintenance in the years following her disappearance, a term left hauntingly undefined. The authenticity of the documents was never confirmed, but they circulated, and the doubt spread with them. In 2019, the family received an anonymous letter claiming that Emanuela's remains were buried within the Vatican itself, specifically in the Teutonic Cemetery, a small shaded courtyard near St. Peter's Basilica. The Vatican responded surprisingly by opening 2 tombs. They were empty. No remains. No trace. Just another hallway that led to nothing. And still, the questions. Why would the Vatican open the tombs at all? Why acknowledge a claim based on an unsigned letter if there was nothing to hide? Was it a gesture of goodwill or quiet damage control? The Orlandi family, especially Emanuela's brother, Pietro, has never stopped asking, never stopped walking the streets, never stopped knocking on doors that never open all the way. In January 2023, under growing public pressure and global attention, the Vatican announced it would re-examine the case. For the first time, the Holy See seemed willing to participate in a broader inquiry. But even then, the language was careful, precise. A search, yes. A re-evaluation, yes. But not a confession, not an explanation. And that is what makes this case so enduring. Not just the heartbreak of a lost teenager, but the atmosphere that surrounds it, a quiet fog of unclarity laced with proximity to power. Conspiracy theorists fill in the silence, as they always do. Some believe Emanuela overheard something she was never meant to hear. Others claim she became the victim of an elite network operating within or around the Vatican, a theory that law enforcement has never substantiated, but that refuses to fade. There are whispers of blackmail, of photographs that never surfaced, of files misfiled or erased, and always the question, if there is nothing to hide, why has it taken this long to look? It's important to remember, no proof has ever linked the Vatican directly to Emanuela's disappearance. No charges, no evidence. Only the coincidence of geography, the tension of proximity, the strange, persistent gravity of an institution known for secrecy, and a story that will not stay buried. The Vatican has dealt with loss before. It has seen war exile fire. But Emanuela's name continues to echo through its halls like a quiet reproach. A reminder that not all mysteries are ancient. Some are modern, raw, personal. When asked how he keeps going, Pietro Orlandi once said, "I believe the walls of silence will fall. One day. Maybe not today, but they will fall. Perhaps they will. Perhaps they already have, but only enough to let light in through the cracks." And so the story remains not unsolved, but unresolved. Suspended between knowing and not knowing. Between what's been said and what's still being withheld. We move on now, not because we want to, but because she would have walked forward too. Some questions follow us, quiet as footsteps in marble corridors. Mystery, Chapter 8, Father Malachi Martin, a warning about Satan. Inside the church. He spoke in a calm voice, deep measured, never hurried. There was no drama in his words, no theatrics, only weight. The kind of weight that settles into the air like a storm you can't see yet, but already feel in your bones. His name was Father Malachi Martin, a Jesuit priest, a theologian, a biblical scholar. But to those who heard him speak in private interviews and hushed late-night broadcasts, he was something else, a messenger, a man carrying a warning too strange to ignore and too dangerous to shout. Born in Ireland in 1921, Malachi Martin rose through the intellectual ranks of the Catholic Church quickly. He held multiple doctorates, spoke numerous languages, and served inside the Vatican as an advisor on theological and diplomatic matters, during the Second Vatican Council. He was not an outsider. He was in the room. He knew the voices. He read the documents. And then one day, he left. In the mid-1960s, Martin requested release from his Jesuit vows. Officially, it was so he could write and speak freely. Unofficially, the reasons were more complicated and far more unsettling. Over the following decades, he would publish a series of books that blurred the line between fiction and revelation, warning of spiritual decay, not outside the church, but within it. He never named names, rarely pointed fingers, but the implications were impossible to miss. In interviews, he spoke of a fifth column inside the Vatican, a small but powerful faction working not in the name of Christ, but in opposition to him. He claimed that certain rituals had taken place not in back alleys or fringe sects, but within the very walls of the Holy See. That an enthronement of a fallen force had occurred sometime in the 1960s. That Satan, not as metaphor, but as intelligence, had entered the church. To many, this sounded like paranoia. To others, it explained something they had long suspected, but never dared to articulate. The slow drift of doctrine, the scandals, the contradictions. Martin never said the church had fallen, but he insisted it had been infiltrated. In his 1996 novel, Windswept House, a work he insisted was 85% fact, Martin described a secret ritual held inside the Vatican involving high-ranking clergy and occult symbols meant to consecrate the church not to God, but to something else. He called it the enthronement of the fallen archangel. In the book, it took place behind locked doors. In the real world, he never confirmed the details, but he never denied them either. For decades, Martin appeared on radio programs and in print interviews, always walking the edge between alarm and control. He spoke of demonic possession as a reality one he had personally encountered. He claimed that full-scale exorcisms were far more common than the public realized, and that some involved people who had never set foot outside the church. He said the smoke of Satan had entered the sanctuary, and he said it quietly. Naturally, not everyone believed him. Church officials distanced themselves. Scholars dismissed his claims as fiction blended with frustration, the perspective of a man disillusioned by reform and politics. But Martin didn't behave like a man seeking fame. He rarely appeared in public. He lived modestly, and when pressed, he always fell back into that same phrase, "They will know in time." In 1999, Father Malachi Martin died suddenly after a fall in his New York apartment. Some said it was an accident. Others weren't so sure. In his final weeks, he had told friends he was being watched, that he felt something was closing in. He was 78 years old. After his death, documents surfaced, nothing conclusive, but intriguing. Personal letters, audio recordings, hints that he had been in possession of materials never made public. Whether those materials still exist remains unknown. Today, his legacy is divided. Some see him as a whistleblower, others a mystic, still others a tragic voice lost to delusion. But the questions he raised remain unresolved. Was he describing a spiritual metaphor for the human failings of a vast institution? Or was he pointing towards something more literal, something darker? And here, once again, the silence speaks. The Vatican has never officially addressed Martin's claims. No confirmations, no denials. Just the same deep quiet that so often wraps itself around the most troubling mysteries. But those who remember him, those who still listen to the old recordings, still quote his cryptic warnings, say that Malachi Martin wasn't trying to tear anything down. He was trying to protect something he believed was already under siege, the soul of the church. He may have been wrong. He may have exaggerated. He may have seen patterns where there were only cracks, or he may have seen clearly and simply spoken too soon. Whatever the truth, his words remain, quiet, unshaken, still waiting like a bell that was rung once long ago and never stopped echoing. We walk forward now through those echoes, into the next shadow, one that lies far beneath. Mystery number 9. The missing Gospels. Why were these scriptures banned? What is scripture and what is silence? In the early centuries of Christianity, that question had no simple answer. The world was fractured politically, culturally, spiritually, and across deserts and cities, monasteries and market stalls, dozens of communities recorded what they believed to be sacred truth. Letters, visions, recollections, teachings. Some read like testimony, others like poetry. Some aligned, some diverged, and then over time, some disappeared. Today, we call them the missing Gospels texts that once circulated among the faithful, but were later declared heretical, unnecessary, or simply too dangerous. Not dangerous in the obvious sense, but dangerous to the consistency of belief, to the clarity of doctrine, dangerous to the story we would come to accept as complete. Among the most well-known are the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and the Gospel of Judas. None of them appear in the New Testament, and yet each of them offers a glimpse into how wide and how contested early Christianity truly was. The Gospel of Thomas, discovered in 1945 among the Nag Hammadi codices buried in the Egyptian desert, contains 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. It is not a narrative, but a collection of teachings, many of them familiar, others quietly provocative. In this text, salvation is not found through suffering or divine sacrifice, but through inner discovery. The kingdom of God, it says, is not coming from the sky. It is already here, within you and around you. The Gospel of Mary presents something else entirely, a voice that history nearly erased. Mary Magdalene is not simply a witness, but a teacher, a bearer of secret knowledge. In one pivotal scene, the male disciples question her authority, unable to accept that she might have received insight they did not. The text breaks off mid-page, damaged by time. But the message remains: there were once voices in the story that did not make it into the final version. And then, the Gospel of Judas, unearthed in the 1970s and translated decades later, it portrays Judas not as traitor, but as chosen. The one disciple who truly understood what Jesus was asking. His betrayal in this version is not an act of betrayal at all, but obedience, a cosmic necessity, a sacrifice within a sacrifice. To many, these texts are historical curiosities, echoes of forgotten sects. But to others, they hint at something more profound, a version of the Christian narrative that was not erased accidentally, but deliberately narrowed. So why were they banned? The official explanation is theological consistency. That early councils, such as those at Nicaea and Chalcedon, worked to define orthodoxy to protect the integrity of the faith from fragmentation. That certain texts were excluded not because they were threatening, but because they were unverified, inconsistent, or theologically unstable. And yet the process was not so clinical. It was political, it was regional, and it was human. Bishops disagreed, scribes interpreted, emperors influenced. As Christianity became institutionalized, woven into the fabric of empires, the space for ambiguity grew smaller. Truth, once plural, had to become singular, and what didn't fit was left behind. What's most striking is that these missing Gospels were not hidden in vaults. They were buried, hidden in caves, jars, and remote tombs far from cities and synods, preserved not by accident but by intent. Someone, perhaps many, risked punishment to preserve them, to wait for a time when someone might read them again. That time came slowly. When the Nag Hammadi texts were first discovered, they were dismissed as Gnostic oddities, fringe writings from fringe believers. But over time, scholars began to see something else. These weren't inventions. They were part of the same early conversation, the same storm of faith and searching that gave us the canonical Gospels. They simply came from different voices. Voices that asked different questions. Voices that dared to answer them too. The Vatican has never officially forbidden the study of these texts. In fact, some of the manuscripts are preserved in Vatican archives and referenced in academic works, but they are not celebrated, not preached, not invited into liturgy. They remain other. One theory suggests that these texts survive not as threats, but as mirrors revealing how fragile and human the early church truly was. Others believe their content holds truths that would destabilize centuries of doctrine, that the God described in some of these writings is not the same, that the path to salvation is not sacrifice but awakening, that Christ was not to be worshipped but understood. And if so, what would that mean? It's important to remember, these are ancient texts. Partial, fragmented, translated across centuries and cultures. Their meanings are layered, complex, often symbolic. They do not shatter belief, but they widen it. And perhaps that is why they remain outside the frame. Because belief, once widened, cannot be narrowed again. There are parallels, too, in other traditions. Lost sutras in Buddhism, suppressed scrolls in Judaism, apocryphal surahs in early Islamic debate. Every great faith has faced the tension between revelation and control, between the voice and the echo. And so the missing Gospels sit quietly now in museums, in digital archives, in private collections, whispering a version of the story that was almost forgotten. Not better, not truer, but different. And it is the difference that still unsettles. What if the story we know is not false, but incomplete? What if the truth has always been a prism, not a mirror? We move forward now, not because this path is finished, but because it leads deeper. Past the texts, past the words, toward the vaults and walls that were never meant to be open, toward the edges of forgetting and the places where memory lives in shadow. Mystery, Third 10. UFO files, hidden by the Vatican. It sounds like science fiction. The kind of story passed around late at night, half smiling, half serious, something between curiosity and conspiracy. But what makes this mystery so compelling is not just the question of if we are alone. It is the possibility that someone already knows and has chosen not to speak. Among the many strange questions surrounding the Vatican, this one stands apart. Not because of its claim, but because of who it involves. Why would the Vatican, a theological body rooted in the spiritual, take such a sustained interest in the stars, in planetary systems, in the idea of life beyond Earth? And if it has, what has it found? The idea that the Vatican might possess confidential knowledge about unidentified aerial phenomena, what we now more carefully call UAPs, is not new. It first surfaced in the mid-20th century, just as global sightings began to accelerate and governments quietly began compiling their own secret files. But while agencies like the CIA, KGB, and US Air Force were expected participants in this growing field of classified inquiry, The Church's presence felt out of place, or perhaps all too appropriate. In 2009, Father Jose Gabriel Funes, then head of the Vatican Observatory, made headlines when he stated that believing in extraterrestrial life does not contradict the Catholic faith. He went further, suggesting that alien life, if it exists, is part of God's creation, brothers and sisters in the cosmic family. It was a thoughtful theological position meant to preempt fear. But it also raised questions. Why say it at all? Why now? There was no public disclosure to prompt the statement, no confirmed sighting, no newly declassified report. And yet, the comment was issued plainly, almost gently, as though preparing the faithful for something inevitable, something long anticipated. Some researchers point to Vatican involvement in Project Blue Book, the U.S. Air Force's investigation into UFO phenomena during the 1950s and 60s, while no direct documentation links the Holy See to the project. Multiple third-party testimonies have suggested informal cooperation information, exchanges, theological consulting, even shared photographic evidence. These claims are unverified and often dismissed, but they persist. Then there is Mount Graham again, the observatory we visited earlier in Arizona, where the Vatican shares access to one of the most advanced infrared telescopes on Earth. Officially, it studies galaxies, black holes, and stellar nurseries. But some theorists believe it's also used to track non-terrestrial anomalies, objects that move without propulsion, lights that appear and vanish without sound, signals that pulse without origin. Of course, no concrete evidence has been released to support these claims. But then again, that's the pattern. Not denial, not confirmation, just silence. More intriguing still is the suggestion that the Vatican maintains a restricted archive of what some call exotheological documents, writings that explore the implications of contact with non-human intelligence. What would it mean for doctrine, for original sin, for the story of salvation? Some say these documents are speculative, the result of academic curiosity. Others insist they are responses prepared not for if contact happens, but for when. In 2014, a leaked email exchange between political figures in the United States referenced a meeting with Vatican officials to discuss the potential reality of extraterrestrial intelligence. The email released through hacked correspondence was widely debated and never confirmed. But its tone was matter-of-fact. There was no disbelief, only planning. Even further back in 1954, a figure named Monsignor Corrado Balducci, a theologian and Vatican consultant on exorcisms, publicly stated that he believed extraterrestrial encounters were real and that they should not be confused with demonic activity. His views were never adopted as official doctrine, but neither were they silenced. He was allowed to speak, to plant a seed. And here we return to the heart of the mystery. Why this slow acknowledgement? Why this careful, measured openness from an institution that is otherwise so cautious, so historically reserved? Some believe the answer lies in stewardship, that the Church, if it has been made aware of phenomena that challenge human understanding, would see itself as responsible for interpreting the implications. To guard not just physical evidence, but metaphysical meaning. Others believe the knowledge is older, still passed down not through governments, but through scrolls, visions, artifacts long lost to the outside world. There are even whispers of ancient texts locked in the deepest vaults of the Vatican Library that describe beings descending from the sky, radiant and powerful, bearing messages not from heaven, but from elsewhere. These stories, if real, may not have been labeled extraterrestrial at all. They would have been interpreted through the lens of the time as angels or demons or divine messengers. But perhaps they were none of those things. Or perhaps they were all of them. Could it be that the lines between the spiritual and the extraterrestrial are not as clear as we imagine? That what we once called celestial, we now call interstellar? That the question is not one of belief versus science, but of language? To date, the Vatican has issued no formal statement on any specific UFO event. It has not confirmed or denied the possession of recovered materials, classified footage, or first-hand testimonies. But it continues to invest in astronomical research. It continues to host theological discussions on cosmic plurality. And it continues to prepare for what we don't know. Perhaps for nothing. Perhaps for everything. But if such knowledge exists, if somewhere deep within the marble walls and hidden corridors of Vatican City, there are records of sightings of contact of something not from here, then its concealment would not be about power. It would be about timing. Because some truths are not rejected. They are deferred, held until the world is ready, or until the world can no longer be protected from them. We move on now quietly. The sky remains above us, as it always has, silent, waiting. And below the earth, another question calls ancient stonebound and wrapped in death. Mystery, Shark 11. The Vatican necropolis. What lies beneath? Beneath the marble floor of St. Peter's Basilica, beneath the altars, the mosaics, the candles flickering quietly in the soft hush of prayer, there is another world. Older, darker, built not to inspire the eye, but to preserve the forgotten. This place is not often spoken of in tour books or sermons, but it exists, and it breathes beneath the stone. They call it the Vatican necropolis. It lies 20 meters below the basilica, a city of the dead carved into the earth, layered in silence and time. Its discovery, at least to the public, is relatively recent. In the 1940s, excavations began under orders from Pope Pius X, who wished to locate the burial place of St. Peter. What the workers found instead was a sprawling complex of tombs, Roman pagan Christian, lined with frescoes, sarcophagi, and inscriptions in languages that had not been spoken aloud in over 1,000 years. And yet, there was no chaos. The necropolis had order, structure, intention. Tombs were arranged with care, often facing east toward the rising sun, or perhaps toward something else. Symbols appeared again and again: the phoenix, the fish, the shepherd, and deeper still, carvings more difficult to decipher. Serpents wrapped in circles, stars with 8 points, winged figures neither Roman nor recognizably Christian. At the heart of it all was an ancient grave marked by a modest structure. The Vatican would later confirm this was the trophy of Gaius, a 2nd century monument believed to mark the burial site of Peter the Apostle. Beneath it, a small wall, a niche, bones. Whether they truly belonged to Peter remains debated, though carbon dating and early graffiti both point toward the possibility. But what surrounds that tomb is what continues to unsettle. Because while the Vatican confirms the existence of the necropolis and even allows limited tours, not all of it is open. Certain areas remain closed. Certain inscriptions have never been released. Certain corridors lined with crumbling walls and faded frescoes are off limits to the public and to most clergy. Why some say it's structural. The underground is fragile at risk of collapse. Others say it's out of reverence, that the tomb's house sacred remains best left undisturbed. But there are whispers of more, of chambers not yet catalogued, of sealed vaults discovered during excavation, then quietly closed again, of relics and writings in pre-Christian symbols, too strange, too unsettling to be revealed without shaking the delicate scaffolding of faith. The Vatican has never commented on these rumors. It maintains that what is known has been shared, that no part of the necropolis is deliberately hidden, only protected, and yet the mystery deepens. In 2013, an anonymous leak surfaced online what claimed to be a photograph of an unlisted chamber beneath the necropolis, a low-ceiling space lined with limestone walls marked not with Latin crosses, but with carvings unfamiliar, even to classical scholars. Geometric patterns, winged discs, eyes without pupils. The Vatican made no statement. The image was dismissed by some as a hoax. But those who study ancient religions noted that the symbols resembled early Mesopotamian iconography, far older than the basilica itself, far older than Rome. Some believe this part of the necropolis sits atop a far more ancient structure, predating Christianity, even predating the Roman Empire. That beneath the known tombs lies another layer, a forgotten layer, one that was never meant to be built over, only sealed. There are stories, too, that during the original excavation, workers encountered rooms that seemed incomplete, not broken, but deliberately unfinished, as if abandoned during construction. Tools still in place, walls left half-carved, and in one account, quickly denied by Vatican officials, a tunnel leading even further downward suddenly filled in and never opened again. Why build a church above a necropolis? Why bury apostles among pagans? The official reasoning is spiritual symbolism, death giving way to resurrection, the old world ceding to the new. But others see something else, a kind of layering, a covering, as though each structure was placed to protect or to hide what came before. And so the Vatican necropolis becomes more than a burial ground. It becomes a boundary between what we know and what we suspect, between the sacred and the forgotten, between the story we've been told and the one still sleeping in the dark. It is worth noting that necropolis cities of the dead are not uncommon in the ancient world. Egypt, Greece, and Mesopotamia all built them. But few were constructed directly beneath sacred religious centers. Fewer still were reopened in modern times, only to be quietly closed again. Some speculate that the Church fears what else might be found. Not heresy, not scandal, but dissonance evidence of ritual symbols or beliefs that might suggest Christianity did not emerge in a vacuum, but was part of something older, wider, more complex. That the story of resurrection is not just a Christian story, but a universal one retold again and again across time in different tongues by different names. We cannot say what lies in the sealed halls beneath St. Peter's, only that they are there. And sometimes what remains buried stays powerful simply because it was buried by choice. So we leave this part of the journey behind, but only physically. It remains with us, underfoot, in shadow. The next step will lead us not into stone, but into fire, a different kind of possession. Mystery, just 12. The Pope's Exorcist Files. Thousands of unpublished cases. They call it the rite, a ceremony of prayer command confrontation. It is older than cathedrals and whispered across cultures, from rural chapels to ancient temples in languages that have no alphabets. But in the modern world, there is one place where this ancient practice is still observed, studied, and above all, recorded: the Vatican. The Church does not shy away from the concept of possession. It never has. It acknowledges formally and without hesitation that evil is not just metaphor, but entity. That spiritual intrusion is real, and that when necessary, it must be confronted not with violence, but with invocation. This confrontation is called exorcism, and the one who performs it is not simply a priest, he is an exorcist. There are many trained quietly in different dioceses around the world. But one title stands above the rest, the Pope's exorcist, a role held by a small number of clergy, deeply trained, given access to the most confidential cases, often consulted when possession is suspected but cannot be explained. For over 30 years, this position was held by Father Gabriele Amorth, a Roman priest who claimed to have performed over 70,000 exorcisms before his death in 2016. 70,000. That number alone invites doubt. It seems impossible. But Father Amorth clarified, some were short prayers of deliverance, brief interventions. Others lasted hours, days, even years. What mattered, he said, was not the ritual itself, but the reason it was needed. And that reason, more often than not, was silence. The Vatican maintains detailed records of every approved exorcism. But these files are not public. They are not digitized. They are not released. The majority remain stored in handwritten reports sealed behind ecclesiastical walls, viewed only by a handful of authorized clergy and scholars. What do they contain? What patterns do they show? And what do they say about the human mind, or the human soul? From the little that has been shared, certain themes emerge. Victims who speak in unknown languages, who display unnatural strength, who know facts they could not possibly know, the secrets of a stranger, the sins of a priest. The Church does not publicize these stories, but it has never denied them either. And when asked why these cases are not shared with the world, the response is careful: to protect the privacy of the afflicted, to avoid sensationalism, to ensure the rite is not reduced to performance. But some believe the reason runs deeper, that among the thousands of files are not just accounts of personal suffering, but events that defy understanding, that some cases were never resolved, that something was invited and stayed. Father Amorth himself hinted at this. In his writings, he described not just individuals, but places that felt possessed. Houses, churches, entire regions where the air seemed wrong, where the soil itself refused to hold peace. He claimed that in some cases, the evil was not external, not a demon to cast out, but something bound to the structure of the world, something that could not be named. And yet the rite was still performed. There are whispers from former seminarians, from unnamed assistants, that deep beneath Vatican City, in rooms few are permitted to enter, the most severe cases were handled. That teams of exorcists handpicked and sworn to secrecy worked on afflictions that never reached public knowledge. That relics were used. That protective circles were drawn. That not all those who entered the room emerged unchanged. Again, we have no documents, no proof, only testimony. But the consistency of that testimony is unsettling. One former Vatican translator, speaking anonymously to an Italian journalist, claimed that a file marked Case A113 was kept separate from the others, not because of content, but because of effect. That those who read it reported nightmares, physical illness, an overwhelming sensation of being watched. The Church has never acknowledged this file. No one can verify it exists. But it is said that Case A113 involved a woman in northern Italy who claimed to be hearing a voice that didn't speak to her, but through her. A voice that predicted earthquakes, illness, the death of a bishop. All of which, according to the report, came to pass. When asked why the Vatican does not release the details of such cases, the answer, if one is given at all, is always the same. Because not all knowledge helps. In recent years, popular media has turned possession into spectacle. Movies book shows they reduce the right to flickering candles and spinning heads. But in the Vatican, it is not entertainment. It is not fiction. It is something else entirely. Something solemn, something dangerous, and something that must be handled with quiet hands. There is no public catalog of these exorcist files, no timeline, no master list, only the quiet knowledge that they exist in drawers, in safes in the minds of men who carry them like scars. Some believe the Vatican knows more than it admits, that buried in these files is not just evidence of the demonic, but maps of spiritual weakness. That patterns exist seasons of increased possession, geographical clusters, triggers, portals. If true, this information would be invaluable or devastating, and perhaps that is why it remains unpublished. Not out of secrecy, but out of protection. Because the right is not a weapon, it is a shield, and some shields are made of silence. We leave this place now gently, with no fear, but with a deeper sense of how much exists just beyond the veil of understanding, and how far some will go to protect us from seeing it. Next, we return not to fire, but to shadow, not a presence, but an idea. One wiped from the map, Mystery 13, the Illuminati within the Vatican. There are certain names that ripple through history, like unfinished sentences, whispered in secret, written in code, denied in daylight, but never entirely gone. One of those names is the Illuminati. To some, it's a fantasy, a meme, a punchline, but to others, it's a pattern, a presence, something felt but never fully seen. The idea of the Illuminati traces back to the 18th century, to Bavaria, where a group of intellectuals sought to promote reason over religious control, secrecy over ceremony. Their goals, they claimed, were enlightenment, freedom, the dismantling of oppressive power. But they were quickly outlawed, forced underground. And that's where the story begins to shift, from recorded history to rumor, from fact to inference. The belief that the Illuminati survived and that it embedded itself in global institutions, including religious ones, has persisted ever since. And nowhere does that suspicion grow more intense than within the walls of the Vatican. But what would it mean to say that the Illuminati, or a group like it, operates inside the Vatican, not symbols on altars, not robe ceremonies in hidden catacombs, but influence, redirection, the subtle reshaping of doctrine policy communication, a shadow hand behind a holy voice. The theory is not born in isolation. Throughout the 20th century, reports surfaced of alleged secret groups within the church. The most infamous of these was Propaganda Due, or P2, a clandestine Masonic lodge with known ties to powerful figures in Italian politics, finance, and yes, even the Vatican. In the 1980s, P2 was implicated in a series of scandals, including the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano, a Vatican-linked bank. The fallout included the mysterious death of banker Roberto Calvi, found hanging from a bridge in London, his pockets filled with bricks, and the suspicious suicide of P2's grandmaster, Lizio Gelli. These events are not fiction. They are documented, investigated, but not entirely explained. And though the Church publicly condemned Freemasonry, internal Vatican documents at the time suggested a more complicated reality with clergy, even bishops accused of maintaining quiet ties to forbidden lodges. The 1983 Code of Canon Law reinforced the ban on Catholics joining Masonic organizations, yet questions remained. Why the need for repetition? Why the ongoing concern? Some believe the Church is not infiltrated by the Illuminati in name but in spirit, that certain individuals operating through elite networks seek not to destroy the Church, but to bend it, to use its vast moral and cultural influence to steer society in a particular direction, not through dogma, through diplomacy, policy, silence. And there are stranger claims still, whispers of secret ceremonies in shadowed rooms, of a black mass not conducted in rebellion against the Church, but within it masked and coded hidden behind layers of ritual. These stories are almost always secondhand, always anonymous, but their persistence is unsettling. In his final years, Father Malachi Martin, whom we've already walked with, often spoke of a superforce inside the Vatican. Not allegory, not metaphor. A force, he said, composed of individuals who had pledged themselves not to Christ, but to a globalist ideology rooted in ancient principles, what he vaguely referred to as the enthronement of a fallen being. He did not call them Illuminati, but he never denied the comparison. There are other signs for those who look. Symbols carved into stonework, argued over by architects and occult historians. Ancient obelisks standing in St. Peter's Square. Relics of Rome's imperial past, aligned with celestial events. The image of the all-seeing eye, the triangle, the light, the watcher, which appears in both esoteric and Catholic iconography, depending on the context. Coincidence, or something older? The Church, of course, has never acknowledged any such presence. And it's important to say, no direct evidence exists tying any modern Vatican official to an Illuminati order. No documents, no names, no photos, only the rhythm of history, only the echo of patterns. So why does the idea persist? Perhaps because it explains what logic cannot. How spiritual decisions sometimes feel political. How moral clarity gives way to strategic ambiguity. How centuries-old institutions change, not with resistance, but with quiet ease. And yet, this theory also reflects something deeper, a longing, a fear, the feeling that the sacred should be pure, and that if it isn't, it must have been taken, twisted, stolen. But what if the truth is quieter than that? What if there is no grand conspiracy? What if there is only the steady pressure of power and the human temptation to wield it? After all, the Church is made of people, and people are drawn to influence secrecy and control no matter the cloth they wear. Still, the question remains, not because we need someone to blame, but because in a world of deep belief, even the slightest shadow can grow into legend. The Vatican will likely never address this mystery, not directly, not officially, but its silence again becomes part of the pattern. So we continue forward, not chasing symbols or names, but following that feeling, that quiet sense that some rooms in the Church are filled with light and others with something else. Something not evil, perhaps, but not entirely holy either. And from here, we move on into a deeper erasure. Not a secret society, but a vanished civilization. Mystery. 14. The vanished popes. Erased from history. History, we assume, is a ledger, a long, continuous line of names and dates carefully written and faithfully kept. Especially in the Vatican, where tradition is preserved with near-sacramental precision, the lineage of popes is more than a record. It is identity, a succession stretching back unbroken to Peter himself. And yet, there are gaps. Not many, but just enough. Popes who ruled, then vanished. Names that once appeared on lists, then disappeared. Reigns too short, deaths too sudden. Or worse, entries erased completely with no explanation. And in those erasures, a silence grows a mystery less about what is known and more about what has been made unknowable. One of the most famous of these absences is Pope Benedict IX, whose papacy was so fragmented, appointed, deposed, reinstated, then resigned, that scholars disagree on how many reigns he actually had. 3-1 none. He was accused of corruption, simony, even sorcery, and is one of the only men in history to have sold the papacy, stepping down in exchange for gold. His name still appears in the records, but always with a shadow. Then there is Pope Joan, or rather, the legend of her. A woman disguised as a man who allegedly rose through the clerical ranks in the 9th century and served as pope for 2 years before giving birth during a procession and being stoned to death. The Vatican has long denied this story as myth, and historians remain divided. But for centuries, it persisted in art, literature, and even ecclesiastical satire, a rumor too resilient to vanish completely. And what is a legend, if not a memory, that refuses to die? But perhaps the most unsettling case is that of Pope John VI, a pope who never existed. If you read through the list of popes, you'll notice something peculiar. There is a John binding but no John Discuss. Scholars explain this as a clerical error, a miscount during the Middle Ages. But even in a system as meticulous as the Vatican's, how does an entire name go missing? More theories emerge. Was there a pope, John XXIII, who ruled briefly, then was removed for reasons never recorded? Was he elected during a schism, then invalidated? Or was he erased intentionally from the official record, his actions or affiliations deemed too dangerous to remember? The idea of erasing a pope is not without precedent. During the Western Schism in the late 14th century, multiple men claimed the papal throne simultaneously. One in Rome, another in Avignon, later one in Pisa. For a time, Christendom was fractured, each faction insisting its pope was legitimate. When the schism ended, many of these claimants were labeled anti-popes. Their reigns retroactively invalidated, their names moved to footnotes, or removed altogether. But what if one of them was real? What if amid the politics and confusion, a pope with unpopular ideas or unauthorized decisions was simply edited out, not in malice, in maintenance, in the quiet upkeep of a cleaner story? Some researchers believe that early church councils deliberately adjusted the succession list to support theological continuity, removing inconvenient gaps, shortening reigns, or skipping questionable figures altogether. In doing so, they created a timeline not of events, but of intentions. Others go further. They argue that one or more popes were not only removed, but buried metaphorically and literally, that their tombs were destroyed, their writings burned, that Vatican archives once held documents referencing their existence, later marked non-extant, does not exist. There are even rumors of encrypted volumes in the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, the Vatican's private archive listing papal claimants, who were not just erased, but condemned, their names preserved only in case they must one day be exonerated. In the 1990s, an anonymous letter surfaced claiming to be written by a Vatican archivist. It described a papal reign lasting only 32 hours, the result of a rushed conclave following a sudden death, a mistaken elevation, and an immediate correction. No press release, no blessing, just a locked room, a sealed coffin, and a decree that it had never happened. The Vatican unsurprisingly, never responded to the letter. But silence, as we've seen, has a weight of its own. Even among the confirmed popes, there are strange deaths. Pope John Paul I, elected in 1978, was found dead just 33 days into his papacy. No autopsy was performed. The cause of death was listed as a heart attack. Yet his sudden passing on the eve of planned reforms and rumored investigations sparked a storm of speculation that still lingers today. Is that silence the result of conspiracy? Perhaps not. Perhaps it's grief, or decorum, or tradition. But in a church that chronicles the minutes of miracles, even the smallest omission becomes suspect. In truth, the mystery of the vanished popes is not about individuals. It is about history itself and who holds the pen. The Vatican is not merely a religious institution. It is a curator of time. It decides not just what is sacred, but what is remembered. And in that power lies the possibility of forgetting not by accident, but by design. So we look again at the list long gilded, carved into stone, and we wonder, who is missing? What did they see? What did they try to change? And what do we risk by never asking? From here we move on from men removed to lands erased, not names this time, but entire continents. Mystery, Dünger 15, Forbidden Maps of Lost Continents, or Other Worlds maps are not just lines and latitude. They are declarations, quiet assertions of what is real, what is known, what has been named. But for as long as humans have drawn the world, there have been maps that do not fit. Maps that suggest the world was known before it was discovered. That someone somewhere once walked the edges of a forgotten earth and recorded it. And some say the Vatican has kept those records. The most famous of these is the Piri Reis map, a world map drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral based on older charts. It famously depicts the coast of South America, and controversially, the edge of what appears to be Antarctica, not under ice as we know it today, but green, exposed, detailed. The cartographic precision of the landmass has baffled historians. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820, and even then, it was already buried under miles of glacial cover. So how could a 16th century mapmaker draw it unless he had access to sources far older? Some researchers believe that earlier civilizations, now lost, explored far beyond what we credit them for. That Phoenicians, Egyptians, or some unnamed seafaring culture reached the poles, mapped the continents, and left behind knowledge that would eventually be preserved and perhaps hidden. Enter the Vatican. As the inheritor of countless ancient libraries, from Alexandria to Byzantium, from pre-Christian Europe to colonial-era acquisitions, the Church possesses one of the largest and most inaccessible collections of early geographical records in existence. And among them, some say, are maps not meant for public view. Maps that show land masses no longer visible. Islands where there are now only waves. Continents absent from modern globes. Some of these are rumored to resemble the legendary continent of Mu, or the sunken lands of Lemuria, or even Atlantis, not as mythical kingdoms, but as geological records erased by flood or ice. One such document whispered of in cartographic circles is the Mappa Mundi Arcanum, allegedly held in the restricted section of the Vatican Library. The name appears in no official catalog, but a handful of early 20th century letters reference a parchment of unknown origin penned in what appears to be Greek and Latin, marked with coastlines that match neither ancient nor modern maps. The letters, now scattered in private collections, describe the map's depiction of a large, symmetrical landmass at the center of the Atlantic, bordered with inscriptions referencing the sons of Poseidon and a cataclysm by fire and sea. Whether the letters are authentic is still debated, but their origin, Vatican archival codes and seals, suggest that someone at some point believed the map to be real. Why would the Church keep such maps? Hidden theories vary. Some say it's to protect fragile relics from misinterpretation or exploitation. Others believe it's more ideological, that acknowledging lost continents or civilizations more advanced than expected could undermine traditional timelines of creation scriptural history or the uniqueness of human revelation. There are even deeper claims, stranger ones, that certain maps depict not Earth at all, but something else. Worlds resembling ours, but with different geographies, different stars, cartographic echoes of parallel realms. One such document, known only as Tabula Umbrae, was allegedly described by an ex-archivist as a map of a world without north, a place lit by two suns, ringed with unfamiliar constellations, yet drawn in recognizable human style. Could these be pure imagination, artistic metaphor? Certainly. But what makes the mystery linger is how little is known and how carefully that unknowing is maintained. In 1966, during a limited exhibit of Renaissance-era navigation tools held in Rome, a single unmarked scroll was briefly displayed, then removed. Witnesses described it as faded, water-damaged, and partially illegible, but showing islands where there should be ocean and mountain ranges not found on any known continent. When questioned, curators cited preservation concerns. The scroll was never displayed again. Satellite imagery in recent decades has also reignited curiosity. Submerged formations in the Caribbean, off the coast of India, and near the poles appear to resemble artificial structures. Ancient road grids, pyramidal shapes, entire plateaus that resemble sunken city blocks. Mainstream geology calls these coincidences tricks of erosion, but others see patterns. And what if the Vatican has seen those patterns too, not with satellites, but through older, more fragile windows? The Church has always been cautious with cosmology. It remembers what happened with Galileo. It remembers how long it took to reconcile heliocentrism, evolution, even the shape of the Earth. Knowledge, when released too quickly, fractures belief. And so perhaps with maps, the most literal form of knowledge, the Church chooses another path. Preservation, containment, waiting. Because if there are lands not marked on our globes, and if those lands were once inhabited, then the story of humanity is incomplete. Or worse, misremembered. And if that's true, what else have we forgotten? The idea of lost continents is easy to dismiss. But history is not kind to certainty. And sometimes the most compelling evidence is not what we see, but what we are no longer allowed to see. So the maps remain. If they exist at all, they remain in drawers that do not open in catalogs, without public entries, in shadows too faint to follow. But something about them lingers. The sense that our world was once bigger, that the horizon used to extend further, that somewhere beyond the edge of our accepted knowledge, there was a shore and someone stood on it. We end the mysteries here, but not the questions. Because behind every locked vault and silent room, something still waits. And now, having followed the trail of the unexplained, the unspoken, the forgotten, we arrive at the threshold of reflection. Not a discovery, but a reckoning. We've traveled through locked doors, walked beneath marble floors, and stood in the hush of long-forgotten names. We've listened not to answers, but to the spaces between them. And now, after all the questions, all the shadows, all the whispers that never quite become words, one quiet thought remains. There's something not quite right, is there? Not wrong exactly, not corrupt, not monstrous, but off, misaligned. Like a painting that's been ever so slightly tilted on the wall, not enough to make you reach out, but just enough to make you stare. Some say mystery is part of faith, that what is hidden is sacred, that silence protects us. But what if silence doesn't always mean reverence? What if sometimes it means restraint? What if the things we're not told are not forgotten but withheld? Because silence true, practice silence is never accidental. It is built, brick by brick, oath by oath. And in a place like the Vatican, where every word echoes silence, echoes loudest. Perhaps these mysteries are just that stories, misunderstood coincidences dressed in myth legends that grew where light could not reach. Or perhaps they are something more. Not conspiracy, but choreography. A careful arrangement of what we're allowed to know and what we're gently kept from knowing. And that's the quiet tension, isn't it? That so much of what we've explored wasn't about what was said, but about what wasn't. The locked rooms, the missing records, the vanished names. The feeling that history is not just written, but edited. Still, we don't accuse. We don't declare. We only wonder. And wondering in a world that so often demands certainty is its own kind of reverence. So wherever you are right now, sitting, lying down, eyes open, or maybe already half closed, take a breath. Let it out slowly. Let the question settle like dust in candlelight. And if your mind drifts back now and then to a door underground, or a scroll behind glass, or a name erased with care, let it. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, just softly remembered. Good night, sleep well, and let the silence speak.